I want to address the thing that we all know about and ask you about it so that we can then move on to the conversation that we're here to have. News yesterday evening that Larry Summers is choosing to step back from his public commitments, something we already knew because he had canceled as the speaker here. Yesterday afternoon, Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, who was a former professor at Harvard, called for the university to cut ties. This is over new revelations in the documents that the House Oversight Committee released last week regarding his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. Some of that had been known, some of it more detail. How is that landing for you, for the economics department, for Harvard?
So Larry has been a good friend of mine for nearly 3 decades now, a colleague and a co-author for 10 of those years. He's talked about how he's deeply ashamed. I think he made the right decision about stepping back from public life to focus on everything he needs to understand about himself, fix and try to do the best he can to repair. I think he's offered an enormous amount intellectually into policy over the last 40 years, and I hope he's in a position to do that again in the future, but now is not the time for that.
Do you believe or do you know if Harvard will take further action?
I don't know anything about Harvard's plans, but there's no Harvard rule I'm aware of that he's broken, and he in his statement distinguished between the job he was hired to do, which is to teach. And just last week, I had lots of students coming to me talking about what an amazing teacher he was, how dedicated, the time he takes to, to talk to them, meet with them. And that's his job. There's then a set of other activities, including things like speaking at things like this that are not his job, and that he's chosen to step back from.
What do you love to teach students the most about the economy, let's say now versus even 2 years ago in the classroom?
I mean, I have the best teaching job in the world. Nearly half of Harvard students take a class that I co-teach called Ec 10. It's Principles of Economics. And it sounds like your sort of easy, basic thing, but what my co-teacher and I try to bring into that classroom is a new lens and way of seeing the world through concepts like, opportunity costs, thinking on the margin, and the like. We try to make it as up-to-date as possible. We bring in psychology and economics. We bring in the latest breakthroughs on empiricism. And we bring in public policy. On Monday, the entire class was devoted to climate change. And so just giving people this way of thinking and showing that economics is not primarily about money and business, but it's about anything. Climate change, poverty, understanding yourself and your own personal life and how to make your own decisions, all of these things, this is a tool you can use, and we try to evangelize that to a terrific group of students.
Our audience is going to have about 20 minutes to ask you their questions at the end. So where I want to go now is I'm going to ask you an umbrella question, and then we'll dive down into some various threads that could be interesting and important for this audience. Do you know the chart in an emergency room with the faces, right, from the biggest frowny faces, the most pain, all the way to the big smiley face? Your assessment of the economy overall right now, where on the smiley chart are we?
I don't know if they have one of the confused shrug emojis on that chart, but that's where I would be. Partly I'm a confused shrug emoji because we haven't gotten any data for the last month and a half. At least we haven't gotten any official government data, and the private data can be helpful, but really it's maybe tea leaves. It might even be sort of animal entrails that you're dissecting when you look at those private data. So partly we don't know. Even before that, there was just an enormous conflicting signal. It looked like GDP growth in the third quarter is on track to being something like 3 to 4%. But job growth has basically stalled out and inflation remains high. Overall, I'm also quite nervous that much of our economy is reliant on one sector, which is AI, and it's reliant on the demand that's coming from the build out, not the supply that's coming from the productivity. So, all in all, I don't think it's terrible by any stretch. It might even be in better shape than I thought earlier this year, but I'm nervous.
So I want to pick up on two threads in that answer. We'll take the second one first. You wrote a piece that I found quite striking, laying out the fact that our GDP growth is basically based in the development of AI infrastructure right now. And you also didn't seem as freaked out about that as I was when I read your piece. So can you talk a little bit more about that for us?
Sure. So first of all, just as a fact, of the economic growth in the first half of this year, 92% of it was attributable to two categories of GDP: information processing systems and software. Together, they're only about 4% of GDP, but they were 92% of growth. So that's just a factual numerical statement. Then there's a causal statement, but for the AI build out, what would have happened? That I can't tell you for sure. I think we would have maybe had lower interest rates, lower construction costs, more of other types of activity, but we wouldn't have had as much growth as we had. Maybe we would have had half as much growth as we had. So somewhere between maybe half and 92%, I would attribute plausibly to the AI build out. The question on everyone's minds is, how long does it last? Right now, there are enormous returns to it, enormously high rents, enormous undercapacity in the sector. So I think this is not like the fiber build it and they will come theory of the bubble 25 years ago. This is 1 out of 10 people in the world are using ChatGPT every single week. And that number is only continuing to go up.
I do think the other question is, should we be troubled by the fact that 92% of growth in GDP came from just two sectors?
I mean, it's better than if the alternative was that it doesn't at all, you didn't get it, then I'd rather have it than nothing. But absolutely. I mean, this is a big bet on one part of the economy. It's jobs in some places, but not others. The unemployment rate in Massachusetts, for example, is well above what it was prior to COVID, much more so than it is in the rest of the country. And part of that is we don't have a lot of people building data centers here in Massachusetts. So it's very unevenly spread across the country. And there's a question of how it gets sustained. I mean, a lot of it, though, is will it lead to transformation in supply and productivity? I am cautiously optimistic. If that happens, then maybe it'll all be worth it. But there is a sense that it's putting a lot of chips on one card.
No pun intended.
Yeah. Oh, good point.
Kind of pun intended. All right, so I want to go back to another thing you said in that first question and pick up that thread for a minute. You said part of the reason I'm confused is because we don't have data. You had written a piece over the summer raising concerns about the independence of the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the quality of the data we would then be getting. Where are you in your confidence or lack thereof about the data that is now coming? And just to remind everybody, it was delayed, not entirely clear if that was by necessity or by choice, but delayed as a result of the government shutdown.
Yeah, so the Bureau of Labor Statistics is several thousand career people and one political person with enormous amounts of integrity. They definitely have big revisions, and that's because they're trying to balance getting the numbers out as quickly as possible and making them as accurate as possible. And that's the way they bridge the two. There's a perfectly good technocratic conversation about how to improve it. But what happened in, I believe it was August, beginning of August, is the president didn't like the numbers. He fired the person and then appointed an unbelievably unqualified person. This unbelievably unqualified person also had like a account making Nazi comments and all sorts of other stuff. Ended up being unconfirmable by the Senate. I hope that's because they thought he was incompetent in his actual ability to do it, not just because of all the other scandals. But it does say there's a line here. The line may not be where I'd like it to be, but there's a line somewhere. Right now, there are no political appointees at the BLS. I have absolute faith. Even with a political appointee, I think it would be quite hard, but maybe not impossible to do anything to manipulate the data.
So let's stay with lines, because one of the other things you've written quite a bit about and focused on over the last, what are we at, 11 months now, is the independence of the Fed. Something you've watched very carefully, both with the president's appointments and his attempt to fire a Fed member, which is a pending case in the U.S. Supreme Court that I know you are watching. What is your read right now on the state of the Fed, its independence, and then I'll ask a couple of follow-up questions.
So another place where I'm cautiously optimistic. There were two interpretations of the president's actions. One is that if the economy turned south, he wanted to be in a position to blame Jay Powell. I don't totally love that, but I get that, and that's politics. And if the Fed wants to be there to take the blame and absorb it, that's not terrible. Another is that he truly had a dedicated project to dismantle the independence of this institution. And that would be quite dangerous in terms of inflation, in terms of risk premiums. It's especially dangerous in a country that has very high debt and high interest payments and a set of incentives for what economists call fiscal dominance associated with that. What the Fed has on its side is financial markets, maybe the Supreme Court, we'll see, but I'm cautiously optimistic about that. I think a number of Republican senators, they've not really joined with his call on Jay Powell. And finally, just the internal culture there is just a remarkable and resilient thing. What my fear is, though, is not that something will happen in the next 3 months, but that there could be a 6-year process of appointment after appointment of different types of people and eroding it. So I'm worried about the long game here, but the short, dramatic one, I think there's enough protections in place.
And Jerome Powell, his term expires, I believe, in May of 2026. So that will be a moment where you have said you'll be looking to the U.S. Senate to see what choices they make about confirmation of a replacement.
Yeah, and a number of the names in the mix are totally mainstream, reasonable, independent people, but not all the names are that, and so we'll have to see who he picks.
Can you sort of break down for us this relationship in Fed policy right now in trying to manage inflation, jobs? You've done some really interesting writing about the interplay between those two, where you think the biggest concern is right now, and what levers you think the Fed is and should be pushing to try to manage that tension. I know that's a lot, but maybe you can, what was the name of your EC class?
EC 10.
Maybe you can give us an EC 10 version of that for the room.
So first of all, there's no easy answer when two parts of your mandate are pulling in different directions. And so I actually think it's healthy within the Fed to have debate. I wouldn't mind that we see more dissents going forward. I think it's been the culture of conformity in the past there has been a problem. But the way I'd see it if I were there right now is that the inflation rate is 1 percentage point above where they want it to be and has been above where they want it to be for 4 years. The unemployment rate is 0.1% above where they want it to be. They have 4.2 in the long run. It's 4.3 right now. And by the way, has only been there for a little bit. And so I do think they need to be more worried about the inflation side of their mandate than the unemployment side of the mandate. So I think they need to factor in the extraordinary stock valuations we're seeing. At a minimum...
Are you concerned about that?
At a minimum, it's a source of demand. So even if you don't want to be in the business of pricking bubbles, and central banks don't like being in that business, it's extra demand, so less reason for interest rate cuts. But then on top of that, yeah, I think when you might be in a bubble and everyone's talking about it possibly being a bubble, maybe you don't want to prick the bubble, but maybe you don't want to sort of blow it up further by cutting interest rates. So sort of taking all of that together, I don't think they should cut rates at their next meeting. That being said, we're going to get unemployment data this week on Thursday, and if that changes my picture of the economy, that would change my recommendation.
Do you have an expectation of what you think that data is going to say? You've been let me give a little context to that. You have been very focused on reduction in the labor force as a result of the current administration's immigration policies and how that affects the unemployment rate, job growth, and the overall economy. What are you anticipating?
Yeah, low double-digit job growth and unemployment rate of 4.3%. Huge confidence band around that. And remember, this is for September, not October. We'd love to know what was going on in October, and I don't think we ever will find out what happened in that month.
Wait,
But
seriously?
I believe that they're not planning to release data for October ever. That they're going to skip.
How
that
big of
month.
a deal is that? Let's go back to our smiley faces to frowny faces, right? How big of a deal is that?
I'm obsessed with these numbers, so for me, it's a huge deal. For the world, yeah, I think it's a problem where the different indicators are sort of pulling you in different directions. If everything was telling the same story, missing out on one beat of one part of the story is fine. But with such a conflicting story right now and trying to tread such a narrow path, yeah, I think it's a problem. But the thing I'd say, and this is what you were referring to in that piece, is if you're not letting in immigrants, 10, 20,000 jobs a month is actually a perfectly respectable job growth rate for the United States. It's not actually catastrophically bad. Our problems are much more on labor supply right now than labor demand, and there's not much the Fed can do to increase labor supply.
Let's do a little thing called a lightning round, which I think can be a lot of fun. And I'll throw you a couple.
When you have good guests, it's fun. I've seen that before. So I'll have another sip of tea, and we'll see how it goes.
Well, so my first question was going to be, do you ever drink coffee?
Rarely.
So why tea?
I don't know. I like get a bit addicted to caffeine, but I don't want none. So green tea seems like
So
right
not herbal tea.
happy
We're still
medium.
going for the caffeine. We're
A
just
little bit.
caffeine light.
Yeah.
Winter sports, outdoors, yes or no?
Skiing
Seriously, how long? How long have you been skiing?
since I was 4, probably.
And would you rather be doing winter sports than summer sports?
Yes.
Dude. Show that you're binge watching right now.
Pluribus, which I think is about the AI build out, but we're going to find out.
And I've heard Pluribus described as something like Severance meets, what's the one where they have their innies and their outies?
That's Severance.
That's Severance, yeah. Oh, and Succession.
In Severance, it's sort of amazing when they do meet each other because it's an innie and an outie.
Yeah, there you go. And book that blew your mind most recently?
The Weirdest People in the World by Joe Heinrich, which is a cultural, economic, evolutionary, etc. history of humanity. And it turns out our key economic innovation was when we stopped marrying our cousins. You'll have to read the book to find out.
I did
how
not have
made
that
the
on my
world we
bingo
have today.
card for this morning. The thing you're going
And I
to...
say this as somebody whose brother dated Stephanie Furman in college. But this is off the record, right?
Yeah. Actually, it's not.
No.
Thing you're going to love most on the Thanksgiving table?
The sweet potatoes provided this a sufficient number of marshmallows, which it may or may not be.
Thing they couldn't pay you to touch on the Thanksgiving table?
I'll have it all. And there's also a price for everything, right?
Yeah. All right. So now I want to come to the entry point. Let's use China as the entry point. But understand that the places that I'm hoping to go are both tariffs and trade overall and industry in Massachusetts. And the reason that I'm choosing to start with China is over a number of years, I've had conversations both with members of our congressional delegation and with former U.S. Ambassador to China, Nicholas Burns, about the tensions between the biotech and life sciences industry in Massachusetts and China's attempt to grow and potentially claim the center of that industry for itself. And then we see a combination of both trade tensions with China and a trade agreement, and also federal funding cuts that have created disinvestment in Massachusetts in that realm. That are, it seems to a layperson, and we're just going to put that in all capital letters, layperson, that's creating some real, something tricky for Massachusetts. So let's start with what is your read on the U.S.-China trade relationship, and how are you feeling about it?
In some ways better than I was 6 months ago. So first of all, just to lay out my cards of what I think ought to be the case. I think both countries get enormous benefits from the economic relationship. My concerns are largely on a national security resilience side, which is very specifically about certain things like microchips and the like. I think we need we should be doing a targeted trade approach that focuses on those issues rather than trying to dismantle the relationship. And in order to do that, we need to get other countries on board because we don't have enough leverage as the United States alone to do it. We're not doing anything like what I just said, so we're not doing anything close to what I think our approach to China should be. But that was my first choice. My last choice is taking a blunderbuss to the whole thing and trying to rapidly sever across all dimensions. I think we're not doing that either, in part because it's so costly to the U.S. economy, in part because China bilaterally probably has more leverage on the United States, as we saw on the rare earths, than the United States has.
Rare earths
on
being the
China.
rare earth minerals that
Yeah,
are
exactly.
component pieces of a lot of technology.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think we're in this middle place where we're not effectively dealing with our biggest problems with China, but we're not bringing a wrecking ball to it either. And we'll see what direction it goes.
All other things being equal, what would you want to see as the next policy step toward China?
I mean, it's not just towards China, it's towards the rest of the world. I mean, the thing that seems most incompetent economically and especially geopolitically in the last 6 months is how we handled India. That was supposed to be the first country we got to deal with. President Trump had a relationship and rapport with Modi, Prime Minister Modi, and instead we're basically in a trade war with a country that I have no idea economically or geopolitically how that happened. That itself has made it harder for us to get what we need to out of China. So there's a lot I'd like to see with China, but honestly, a better trade relationship with India is like my sort of going to be on my Christmas wish list.
Is there anything about the president's approach to tariffs? And I'm going to set the open questions, which are being determined by the courts, about the legality of his use of emergency powers to set these tariff policies. But is there anything about, let's look at them from a negotiating tactics standpoint. Is there anything about it that you think is wise or effective or has surprised you in some way in the way that it has worked?
I am surprised that there has been so little retaliation. I expected a lot more retaliation from other countries. It still could come. They are talking about it and thinking about it for the future. But that being said, I don't think we want to think like mercantilists. In some sense, to simplify, for the U.S. Europe, my first choice would be 0% U.S. tariff, 0% European tariff. Next choice would be 15% U.S. and 0% Europe. And then the worst would be 15 and 15. And so, again, we're in that middle without the retaliation, but we are hurting ourselves with the 15% tariff. So it's not like we won, we lost. And it's damaging our economy more than it's damaging the European economy, but it's not damaging it quite as much. In terms of the concessions, it's not clear which concessions are real or not. I think it is possible we will get more foreign direct investment, of which a number of countries have promised it. Japan, I think, is the most plausible to actually deliver, that we would not have gotten but for this. I can't imagine that's worth the cost of all these tariffs, though.
Let's come back now to China policy and tariff policy. I suppose we have to kind of reach out there, grab Canada, and pull it onto the table now, too, and talk about what you're seeing in the impacts for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. What you are worried about, what others peoples are worried about that you are not. Give us your take on where we are in the state economy, where Associated Industries of Massachusetts has shown its business survey, attitude survey toward the economy every month. Respondents stay in that mildly pessimistic range.
Yeah, if you look at Massachusetts, before COVID hit, our unemployment rate was 3%. At a time when the national unemployment rate was around 4%. Now we're 4.8% at a time when the national unemployment rate is 4.3%. So we went from half a point or a point below it to half a point above it.
But was that state mismanagement, federal policy,
I think
of both?
I love our governor, our mayors. I love everyone. I just don't think they matter a massive amount for those types of things.
You think it's
things
macro?
Like the way in which different industries are disproportionately affected. As I said, if a lot of your growth is coming from building data centers and building energy for data centers, not a lot of that here in Massachusetts. The educational cutbacks are hurting us, and we're sort of exposed to global trade, and the volume of that is shrinking. So there's a number of different things happening here. I don't think it's terrible, but Job growth is basically slowed to a halt here in Massachusetts.
Does that mean that our leadership needs to make a new or different bet on a different emerging economy in Massachusetts?
I mean, one area where I think you can always do more is in your housing sector. And there's a lot of jobs in that. And then there's a lot of people who want houses and worried about housing affordability. In Cambridge, we reduced the rules on building. It's definitely controversial with my neighbors. It's controversial with others. I don't think, I've seen you interview Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson on abundance. Abundance means you're going to have more. Doesn't mean it's all going to be simple and trade-off free. But on balance, I am enthusiastic about trying to do more by getting rid of zoning restrictions and the like in the housing sector.
Just an aside, the two of them wrote a book on the abundance agenda, which was a sort of different roadmap for progressive politics in America. So I want to come back.
But oddly did not address the issue of cousin marriage.
I did not. That is true. And once again, not on my bingo card. I do want to come back to that for a second, because a minute ago you said you don't necessarily feel that local leadership has a lot to do with sort of the overall state of the economy in Massachusetts. But my understanding is that our biggest driver to lack of affordability and housing development outside of cost of supply is in fact zoning, which is an incredibly local issue.
So yes, absolutely. I think local leaders bear a lot of responsibility and have a lot of tools in certain sectors of the economy. So they can't do the big macro stuff. They can't change what the funding of universities is. They can't change global trade. But housing is, I think, probably the most economically and important and significant thing, where absolutely rules that restrict what you can build can have a big impact. That's going really in the right direction in Massachusetts. The MBTA Communities Act, what a number of different cities in the Boston area have done. I think also just more and more people in the political system are talking about it, in part because of the Abundance book, in part because this issue of housing affordability has always been there, but politically it's become more and more salient. So that, in sort of macroeconomic terms, is probably the largest lever local leaders have.
So let's stay with this macroeconomic for a minute, because one of the questions that's come up for me, especially after reading a ton of what you've written over the last few days, is this hash mark of 2020, right? Where COVID comes, our economy changes, we have this massive disruption. And I'm trying to understand to what extent that actually is the inflection point that is driving much of what we see now, or whether it was important noise, but noise in a larger arc that went back to, 2008, 1998? How important is it in a larger arc, or is it the moment?
I think it's remarkable how possibly unimportant COVID was. If you handed a Martian data on the real economy, not price level, but the unemployment rate, GDP, all that type of stuff, through 2019, and then showed them that data again starting in 2022, I'm not sure they would have realized just how massive and dramatic an event happened in between. Now, there's things like the increase in work from home, but even that's starting to decline now, and my guess is in 2 years we'll be sort of where it would have been in 2027, absent the whole COVID disruption. One good thing that happened before the COVID period, during the COVID period, and after the COVID period is wages for people at the 10th and 20th percentile actually grew faster than wages for people at the 90th percentile, and so we've started to compress some of the wage gaps that have been long-standing and previously had been growing in the U.S. economy. So I think it's sort of amazing how unscathed we were.
So in about 2 minutes, we'll be going to audience questions, and that's sort of my cue to the folks with mics to start getting ready for that. And we will finish at 9 o'clock. People who do live radio know how to hit a post. So we will finish at 9 o'clock. Will there be like
music and stuff?
Yeah, we're going to play you off. That's right. But I do want to ask you just briefly, and it's a big question, so you're going to laugh at me for asking you to answer it briefly. Over the last decade, one thing you got spectacularly wrong and one thing you got spectacularly right.
Spectacularly wrong, I'm going to stretch it back a little bit further when we were working on the Obama fiscal stimulus and had the view that we should do as much as we possibly could. I think I actually did get that right. But that if we didn't and the economy was still bad, that would mean Congress would want to do even more. And so it would be almost like an automatically correcting political mechanism. And instead, what happened was things was worse than we thought, and that made Congress think, oh, the medicine might actually have caused part of the disease. We want to do even less of it. So misreading the political economy of fiscal stimulus and not getting even more at the moment of maximum peril because we really couldn't go back in the way that I had been hoping and expecting. On right, I think I was very early on the size of the fiscal stimulus leading to inflation and expressed that view extremely strongly to the
This is in
people
the COVID
designing
era?
that plan. What?
This is the COVID.
Sorry,
stimulus.
the 2021
Yeah.
stimulus, and expressed that view very strongly internally to the team putting it together, expressed that view in public, and I think unfortunately that plan was way oversized relative to the problem we had at the time and did play a role in the inflation we've had.
Thank you. I'm going to open it to the audience now. As always, we would ask you, please introduce yourself, and then if you could keep your question tight and in the form of a question, it's what serves the community the most. Who would like to ask one? Right there. Thank you.
Good morning. David Leonard, Boston Public Library. I worry in economic conversations we don't pay enough attention to the issue of wealth inequality. You maybe touched on it with the wage gap compression issue, but if we don't have increased upward mobility, we don't have a healthy economy. That would be my premise. Love your comments on that. And how do we actually measure that in a real way?
Thank you.
Yeah, so first of all, it's literally quite difficult to measure wealth inequality. The Fed does a survey every 3 years called the Survey of Consumer Finances, but to my knowledge, like Warren Buffett and Elon Musk aren't people that were in that survey. There's some researchers that take people's tax returns and look at them. The problem is your tax returns, you put down your income, not your wealth. And so they do things like, oh, this is how much interest you got. I'll multiply it by 20, and that's how much you must have had in the bank or the bonds or whatever. And as you imagine, it's extremely sensitive to how you do that calculation, and different researchers have come up with different numbers. However you look at it, no doubt there is extraordinary dispersion of wealth inequality in this country. I guess as a matter of policy, I'm more focused on income. In part, that's what we can measure. In part, that's the lever most of our policies operate on. You don't sort of just hand somebody a lot of money, but you can figure out how to get them a better job, how to make sure jobs pay better, how to make sure they're better equipped to succeed in those jobs, how to make sure there are more jobs. Every one of those things operates on the margin of income, and obviously over time, income translates into wealth as people save it. So in some ways, I think it's an interesting thing, wealth inequality, but for public policy, I do confess I am focused more on wages and incomes, and that'll get to the wealth eventually.
Although I do want to follow, Boston College's Ray Madoff has written a book recently that I talked to her about, arguing that the tax code creates greater inequality because of the way it treats wealth versus income, and that's fixable. One sentence reaction.
I think we can tax capital income much better than we do, and you actually don't. And it might be exactly the same place that book, which I haven't read, I'm sorry to say, is getting to. But so we might be convergent, but I would just use the income from the capital rather than the capital itself.
Thank you. Next question.
Don Jones, Bank of America. Noah Smith wrote a Substack advocating that we use Singapore's government strategy to address housing disparities of ownership of housing specifically for young people in the U.S. What is your view on the best way to address the home ownership gap in terms of percentage of home ownership for people of the different generations, younger generations versus older generations in the U.S.?
Yeah, so Noah Smith has a terrific Substack. Every single one of them is in my email, but I don't have time to read all of them. And I marvel at how much he can write. So I missed that one. But first of all, supply, we need to build more housing. There's been some attentiveness to the issue of the incentives for people to sell or move houses. For example, super popular policy of if property taxes escalated more as people got older, maybe they would choose to move and somebody else would move into that house. I don't imagine anyone's going to actually do that. I also think there's a real role for things like housing vouchers to play for certain communities. That's not like middle class, but that is people who want to get and work hard to get into the middle class. And a lot of that, Raj Chetty and others at Harvard have done amazing research on the role that mobility can play in that respect, and where you live mattering a lot.
Next question, please. And I've seen hands, pardon me for pointing, here, here, here.
Hi, Catherine Snow, Harvard Graduate School of Education. So I'm going to ask the obvious question about education and its relationship to the growth or decline in the employment sector, and in particular the relative investment in higher ed, producing Harvard undergrads who all want to go to Wall Street and make a lot of money versus trade schools, vocational education, that sort of component of professional and occupation preparation. What would you recommend if you had President Trump's ear, which I presume you don't?
Thank you.
This was on the record, so maybe this will get to him. I think there's a lot of great economic evidence around things like community college. If you look at the economic evidence around training programs, we all want, training, job training, people being retrained if they lose their jobs. Unfortunately, on job training in general, the evidence is quite mixed. Some things work, some things don't. We're not quite sure why some work and why some don't work. But on community college, the evidence is really quite consistent. We had something during the Obama administration where we talked about making community college free. And it actually wasn't that costly because a lot of it is really quite cheap already. And our thought was psychologically, it gets you to this place where you understand that it's free. So that was an appealing idea to me then, and I haven't learned enough since then to have changed my mind.
Others? We'll go there. Great.
Hi, Paul Mailman. You haven't mentioned biotechnology. You mentioned the other places around the country have spent a long time, have spent a lot of resources in building up AI infrastructure. How do you feel the infrastructure that we built over a span of years in this area in Massachusetts serve us over the longer term?
Yeah, so first of all, I wouldn't be surprised if you know more about the answer to your question than I do, just from the way you asked it. But biotech, yeah, I think if you did the type of that 92% calculation I did for the country with data centers, and you did that for biotech, it would be like 0. Not 0.0, 0 point something. If you did it for Massachusetts, I have no doubt it would be higher. You just need to walk around this area, and you can see some of the build out with your own eyes. We're going to see how sensitive that is to government funding. Government funding is nothing in the AI space. It's a lot more in the biotech space and what happens to government's funding and where it goes. So, yeah, I think in some ways your question is, my guess is it's a quite important thing for Massachusetts.
How sensitive do you think it is?
I mean, there's a lot of money and a lot of capital going into it, but roughly half of more than half of the R&D is federally funded, and that really is being cut back. And I think that money has spillovers. If you cut it back, I think you get less of the other stuff, not more of the other stuff, making up for it.
So that's pretty sensitive.
I worry a lot about that. Yes.
Does that help answer your question? What else?
Thank you, Professor Furman. Bessie Young. My question to you is related to AI and also the national physical concern. Do you feel like AI-driven productivity gain could expand United States' future tax base enough so that we might be over-concerning about national physical concern? And also curious on your thoughts on AI-related job market in the future.
Okay, I didn't understand exactly what you mean by national physical concern, so let me answer something that may or may not have been your question, which is our budget deficit, which is extraordinary for a time of peace and prosperity. our debt as well, extraordinary for a time of peace and prosperity. AI would need to add about 1.2 percentage points to our productivity growth to solve that problem. Our productivity growth, just for context, is 1.7, so we need to take it from 1.7 to about 3. That is not what I would count on happening. So I think AI, if it works out, and I'm somewhat optimistic, will add to that 1.7% productivity growth, but not enough that we need to stop worrying about all of our problems, whether it's wealth inequality, income, the budget deficit, et cetera. In terms of jobs, in my class, we make sure to teach students the truth about every topic because we want them to come away without misleading answers. And we do teach them the truth about the impact that AI will have over the next couple decades on jobs. And the way we teach them the truth is that both my co-instructor and I get up on stage. I say, don't worry, here's why. He says you should panic, here's why, and one of us is right. He's not here to defend himself, so I'll just say we have 150 years of data of the unemployment rate always being about 4%, or if it's not about 4%, it's because the economy is doing badly, not because there's a lot of productivity growth. No one could have imagined all the agriculture jobs being replaced. No one could imagine, CAT scan operators being a job category. A lot of what it does is replace parts of jobs. A decade ago, people said, stop training radiologists. We have more radiologists now than we had then because it helps them do their job and do their job better. Same thing we saw with spreadsheets and accounting. So I am largely sanguine about AI and jobs and think the productivity will raise wages, maybe even help middle-skilled people more than high-skilled people and compress some of the inequality. That being said, I'm not totally confident, which is why you should bring David Laibson here the next time.
So I'm going to invite you to channel him because I'm assuming you're listening when he's on stage, and so you know roughly what he would argue. What would his basic counterpoint to what you just said be?
That this is a self-improving technology that will reach a place that previous general-purpose technologies haven't. That a lot of it substitutes for skills, not complements the skills, and that horses are basically willing to work for nothing, and despite that, most of us don't choose to hire them. That the same could happen to humans.
Also not on my bingo card for today. Next question, please. Over here in front. Thank you.
Thank you. Samawa Arenas. Wondering what your perspective is on the economic impact of federal action on immigration, all the way from H-1B visas to the deportation of low-income and low-wage workers and small businesses. Thank you.
Yeah, just to give a little bit of context, stepping back, when I was in the Obama administration, the G20 set a goal that we would all put our growth plans out and send them to the World Bank, IMF, and OECD, which would work together to score them for each of the 20 countries. And we all submitted our growth plans, and they came back with, here's how much it'll raise growth over the next 5 or 10 years. I can't remember the period of time. China was number 1, and their plan was to make up new growth numbers. The United States was number 2. And it's because we had immigration increases as part of that plan, and no one else came close to us because no one else had that. So to me, it is far and away the most important part of economic growth. And it affects 2 things. There's, growth is, GDP is like Y, and it equals Y divided by L times L. That's like a pretty simple equation. Y divided by L is how much productivity you have, how much output per worker. And that's where the H-1B people come in. And it's been a really important source of our productivity growth and our dynamism. And then L is the number of people that you have. And that's why 2 years ago, our economy was adding over 200,000 jobs a year. And now our economy is adding, maybe 20,000 jobs. 200,000 jobs a month. Now it's adding like 20,000 jobs a month. We'd have actually declining employment in this country were it not for immigration. So I think this is a really, really quite big issue. To be clear, I don't think lawless immigration is the solution. I think you need to have a law that works well economically, works well for your society, and enforce that law. That's not where we were 2 years ago, so I don't think that's the ideal we want to go back to. But this, to me, is really probably the most consequential economically, much more than the tariffs and the Fed that we talked about before.
Because I want to be so careful with getting us out at 9 o'clock, I will ask for a quick last question and a quick last answer before we wrap right here. Thank you.
Well, I hope it can be quick. Hi, I'm Diane Patrick. I bring greetings from my husband, who's a colleague of yours at the Kennedy School, Deval Patrick.
Oh.
I don't know whether you were an architect or part of the architecture of Obamacare when you were in the Obama.
I worked very closely on it.
I assume so. What will be the impact on our economy if Obamacare is allowed to die?
To be honest, I just am much, much, much more worried about the impact it'll have on the number of uninsured, which will be, I can't remember, but about 5 million. You know, in terms of a macro impact for growth, I honestly think we can handle it. For unemployment, I think we can handle it. The reason I care about it is the number of people we insured through that expansion. And by the way, that expansion was something that people were in favor of before COVID. They took advantage of COVID to get it into the law, but it was always an important permanent idea to build on the Affordable Care Act, and I hope we can come back to it and revive those subsidies after they are likely to expire on January 1st.
Okay, and my last question for you briefly before we hand the mic back to Margaret Lowe. We're your students in this moment. What is the thing, economic factor we may not be thinking about that we should educate ourselves about in the coming months?
That's a hard one. I mean, honestly, AI to me is just the most important thing on the demand side of the economy, the most important thing on the supply side of the economy. We are all inundated with articles, talks, discussions about it, but even all that inundation is not proportional to how important how we handle the issue and the consequences of it will be. So that's my obvious answer for you.
Please join me in thanking Jason Furman.
Thank you.